In this part, we're going to be going over the object manager and nesting when dealing with hypernurbs. Now, whenever you're modeling and you have an object inside of a hypernurbs, sometimes you may find yourself having to split off certain parts of the geometry. And when you do that, it adds an additional object that becomes a second child of the hypernurb object. So let me give you a little example. Okay, so let's just say that this inner extrusion here, this piece that's sticking out of the middle that we just extruded outward, let's say that we want to make that a separate piece of geometry for whatever reasons. So what we would do is we'll use the loop selection tool to select that, and then we'll hit UF for the fill and hold down shift, and then we'll just fill that outside face there. So now we have that selected. So I'll turn the hypernurb back on, and I want to use the split command. And I have mine here docked here in this little palette, and of course you probably don't have yours docked. So in order to get to that, we need to go to Mesh, Commands, Split. So once we do that, it splits off the geometry. But it doesn't actually take the original geometry and break it off. What it does is it makes a copy of your selection and then splits off the copy. So what we need to do is delete these selected polygons. So we'll hit delete. That will delete them. And now we have two objects. The first one here, and I'll just turn the hypernurb off. And this first one here is the main cube object here that we originally started with, and then the second cube that was split off is our end piece here. Now if you notice, as soon as I turn the hypernurb on, only one of these objects is being affected by the hypernurb and the other one is not. Now of course the one that's being affected would be the first child of the hypernurb, which is this first cube here, because it is the first child of the parent, which is the hypernurb. And this cube object is the one that's being affected. But notice that the cube underneath that we split off is not being affected. This is because the hypernurb will only affect the first child. So if we have many different objects that are all children of a hypernurbs object, the first child is the only one that's going to be affected. That means all of the other children will not be affected at all by the hypernurbs. Only the first one will be smooth. So what a lot of people like to do to solve this issue is to create additional hypernurbs. So we'll create a second one, and then we'll take our cube that we split off and we'll drop that into our hypernurb. Now both of our cube objects are being affected. Now this can lead to problems, and I'll give you an example why. For those of you that have ever used After Effects, I'm sure you've probably heard the term nested composition. And what that means is you have one composition inside of another. And sometimes you have to be well aware of how many nested compositions you have. Otherwise, you can start running into problems and you'll forget that you have a composition inside of another one. Well, this is the same case with hypernurbs. A lot of people tend to have multiple objects that they want to be affected by a hypernurbs object. And when they do that, instead of using one hypernurbs like I'm going to show you here in a moment, they have many different hypernurbs. Now in some cases I've seen people have 20 or up to 30 or more hypernurbs in their scene. And this can cause a lot of problems because you kind of lose count, and some of your hypernurbs may have a editor count or a renderer count of a high value when they don't actually need it. What that means is that your viewport performance is going to be slower, and it's also going to increase render time. Now, since the object manager executes from top to bottom, that means it has to go through all of those hypernurbs and execute them in that order. Now, let's just say that you have a null object. So I'm going to create a null, and I'm going to duplicate this null a couple of times. Now, let's say this hypernurb is a child of that null. This null is in here. This hypernurb is a child of that one. We'll put that one in there. Now this hierarchy here is actually quite simple compared to some hierarchies that I have seen in some scene files. But you'll notice that in order to get to these hypernurbs, you're going to have to go through all of these nulls to get to them. Now, if your null objects are not expanded, then that means you have to take the time in order to expand them all to go find your hypernurb objects. So you have to expand each null in order to go and find them. And before you know it, depending on how complex your scene is, you could end up with a lot of hypernurbs that are buried within multiple null objects, and it just makes it more difficult in order to find them. So the way to work around this problem is very simple. So I'm going to take our cube objects out, and I'm just going to delete all this other stuff. So we'll create our hypernurb. Now we know we can't have multiple objects inside of a hypernurbs because we know that the first one is seen and all the other children will be ignored. So the way to work around this is simply by using a null object as the first parent and then place all of your objects inside of the null. So here we have these two cubes, and we need to create a null object, drop that into the hypernurb as the first child, and then take your two objects, in this case the two cubes, drop them into the null, and now both of them are being affected. And this is not limited to two, we can actually have more than that. So what I'll do is I'll grab another cube and slide it over, and I'll just make a couple copies of this cube. And then we'll take these three and we'll drop them into the null as well. Now you can see we only have one hypernurb object and we have 5 objects that are being affected by it. Now this method works really well, but sometimes it can cause a little trouble. Let's say you want to animate one of these objects. So we want to animate this cube. But let's just say at the same time you want to animate the null or the hypernurb object itself. So here we have the null, and let's say we want to animate this just spinning around in the heading value. So I'll make a keyframe on frame 0 and we'll go to frame 90, and I will just type in 360 just to do a complete 360-degree rotation, make another keyframe. Okay, so that's our basic movement. Now, what if we want to animate the position of this rear cube, but we don't want it to be affected by the rotation of our null object? Because right now, if we were to take this cube and move it back, you can see it's in the X direction. So for the X value here, we'll just make a keyframe, and then we'll go to frame 90, and I'll just pull that back a little bit and make another keyframe. Now watch what happens here when we hit play. The cube is moving in the negative X direction, but it's also spinning around because it's a child of the null object. Now in this case, we don't want that. What we want is this cube to be stationary and just slide back while these other cubes here spin around. Now one way to work around this is just to add an additional hypernurb object, and then drag this cube into that hypernurb, and then just animate either the cube or the hypernurb object. However, there is another way of doing this while maintaining the use of only one hypernurbs object, and that is by using the constraints. So we know that we want this cube here in the back not to be affected by the rotation or position of this null object that's spinning, which is causing everything to spin. We only want this cube to just move back and forth. That's the only thing we want this cube to do. So in order to do this, we need to create a null object, because the null is what we're going to constrain this cube to. So we need to create a null object, and we first want to select the object in which we're going to constrain. In this case, it's the cube. So we want to select the cube first, then we want to hold down Control, and we want to click the object that we're going to constrain it to. In this case, it's the null object. So while holding down Control, or Command if you're on a Mac, click the null object. That will select both of them. Now we'll go up here to Character, Constraints, Add, Position Constraint. Now what we've done is we've taken this cube and we've constrained it to the null. So from now on, we no longer need to move this cube. We can move it by animating the null. So we'll click on the null, and now we'll push the null back. Okay, so you can see that part of this is working, the other part is not. The part that's working is it's keeping it constrained to this position. However, you can see it's still rotating. So we need to stop the rotating from happening. So I'm just going to let this continue to play, and we're going to come over here to the constraint tag. And down here in the bottom we have PSR, and by default only this position is enabled. So we just need to enable rotation. And by doing that, now we have stopped the rotation on this cube here in the rear. So now we can take that cube and animate it wherever we want to animate it to, just by animating the null instead of actually animating the cube, because the cube is constrained to follow the null. So I'll go to frame 0, and with the null selected, I'll just make a keyframe, and then we'll forward to frame 90, and I'll just pull that back. I'll make another keyframe, and then we'll just hit play, and there you go. So whenever you're working with hypernurbs and you're using subdivision modeling, sometimes you may find yourself splitting off multiple sections of your mesh, or you may find yourself having multiple objects inside of the hypernurb. So instead of creating a bunch of hypernurbs, perhaps maybe a more easier and quicker method to keep things neater and easier to find in your object manager is simply use the position constraint in order to constrain your objects that are children of the null inside the hypernurb to a master null, and then all you need to do is animate that master null object.